Welcome on board, chosen one. Let's stop pretending this started today. It didn't. It started the moment they laughed and said, "Who do you think you are?" It started when they dismissed you, minimized you, told others you were nothing special, told you to bow, to wait your turn, to stay quiet. They said you were imagining things. They said nobody was watching. They said you were paranoid. Funny how quiet they got once the results showed up. Look who finally noticed the shift. Look who stopped joking. Look who suddenly started whispering your name behind closed doors. The same people who said you would never matter are now studying your moves like a final exam. Not because you begged for attention, but because your silence became louder than their noise. You didn't chase relevance. You became unavoidable. This is the part nobody warns them about. When someone survives months of pressure, isolation, and doubt without breaking, observers don't feel inspired. They feel threatened. They start counting your steps, replaying your words, trying to decode your calm. They want to know how you stayed standing while they were busy mocking from the sidelines. That curiosity turns into fear very fast. They said, "Oh, the legend needs to bow." You didn't. They said, "Watch how reality humbles them." It didn't. They said, "Give it time, they'll crack." You didn't. And now the watchers want a meeting. Let's be clear, this isn't respect. This is damage control. This is people realizing they underestimated the wrong person for too long. They've been watching you for months because your consistency didn't match their narrative. You didn't spiral. You didn't self-destruct. You didn't ask permission. You moved quietly, learned fast, and adapted while they stayed stuck repeating old jokes. There's a strange silence that comes after that kind of realization. You feel it in rooms before you hear it in words. Conversations stop when you enter. Smiles arrive late and leave early. Compliments sound forced. The atmosphere changes because the power dynamic already did. You're not fighting a battle anymore. You're standing in the aftermath of one. Right here, press the like button and subscribe. Do it as a way of paying this message back and strengthening the voice that refuses to be erased. Back to business. They didn't watch you because you were loud. They watched you because you were controlled. Because while others were flexing for attention, you were building something real. Because you didn't explain yourself every time they misunderstood you. Because you let results do the talking and silence do the cutting. That kind of restraint scares people who rely on chaos to feel important. Here's the exposed truth they won't admit out loud. You remind them of what they didn't become. Every time they replay your journey, they see the moment they quit, the shortcut they took, the excuse they clung to. That's why your existence irritates them, not your success, your discipline. Think back to the past version of you, the one who was overlooked, laughed at, underestimated, told to wait, told to calm down, told to be realistic. That version took the hits quietly and kept moving. While others were busy announcing plans, you were collecting skills. While others were begging for validation, you were building leverage. That's not luck. That's structure. The universe responds to patterns, not promises. And your pattern changed. Now the watchers want proximity. They want a seat at the table they said you'd never reach. They want to ask questions they once mocked. They want to understand you, which is a polite way of saying they're late, and they know it. Meetings like this don't happen when people feel superior. They happen when people feel behind. This is where the villain becomes the hero, not by apologizing, not by softening, not by shrinking, by staying exactly who you became, calm, observant, unrushed. You don't walk into that meeting to prove anything. You walk in knowing the scoreboard already exists. You don't explain your power, you let them feel it in the room. They thought watching you would give them control. Instead, it exposed their obsession. The hunters became nervous, the judges became quiet, the critics became curious. That's what happens when someone outgrows the story written about them. This intro isn't a hype speech, it's a confirmation. You weren't crazy, you weren't imagining the eyes, you weren't wrong about the tension. They were watching you because something about you refused to collapse. And now they want a meeting because they finally understand something terrifying. You didn't survive to be invited, you survived to be unavoidable. And now pause right here for a second, because this is the doorway, not the flashy part, not the loud part, the part where people either stay or quietly disappear. If you've felt eyes on you for months, if you've sensed the shift before anyone said a word, this is where it gets uncomfortable and real. The watchers didn't just observe your wins. They studied how you survived the quiet, how you handled being alone, how you moved when no one was clapping. That's why this next part matters. This isn't entertainment anymore. This is decoding what they were trying to figure out. So if this message is landing a little too close to home, don't scroll, don't rush. Hit the like button and subscribe right now as a signal that you're staying for the full breakdown. Not for me, for yourself. For the part of you that knows this isn't coincidence. You don't get watched for months by accident. Drop a comment with 777 if you're ready to understand why the watching turned into a meeting request. That number isn't magic. It's a marker. It tells me you're locked in, focused, and willing to face what most people avoid. Because once you see how the watchers think, how power actually shifts, and why silence made you dangerous, you don't go back to being confused. Now we move step by step, slow, precise, no noise, and if you're really who this message is for, you'll feel the pull to stay until the end. Let's begin. Number 1. The moment they realized you were not crazy. They didn't start watching because you were weak. They started watching because you didn't fold. This didn't begin with drama. It began with repetition, the same faces appearing too often, the same questions asked in slightly different ways, the same pauses when you entered a room. 6 months ago, something shifted, and you felt it before you could explain it. Not fear, awareness, the kind that makes your spine straighten and your instincts stop sleeping. You noticed patterns because patterns are loud to people who think for themselves. That's where they messed up. They assumed confusion would silence you. Instead, it sharpened you. They wanted you to doubt yourself. That was the first move. Make the subject question their own perception. Make them laugh it off. Make them say, "I'm probably overthinking." That's the oldest trick in the book. Gaslight until the fire goes out. Except it didn't. You didn't spiral. You didn't announce suspicions. You didn't seek reassurance. You watched back, quietly, patiently, like someone who understands that information is leverage. Look at the irony. The moment they began observing you, they exposed themselves. A watcher always leaves fingerprints, a little too curious, a little too interested, asking questions that don't match the relationship. Showing up without reason. Paying attention where attention wasn't invited. They thought they were invisible. They forgot one thing. You weren't asleep. This is where the enemy gets uncomfortable, because here's the truth they hate. You didn't react emotionally. You didn't confront. You didn't panic. You adapted. You started moving differently, sharing less, listening more, letting people talk themselves into revealing intent. You didn't become paranoid. You became precise. And precision is terrifying to people who rely on chaos and noise. They said, "It's nothing." They said, "You're imagining things." They said, "Relax, nobody cares that much." And yet, here they are, watching, tracking, comparing notes, acting like coincidence still applies. Let's answer the question forming in your mind right now. Why you? Because you didn't behave like someone who needed approval, because you didn't chase attention, because you didn't collapse under pressure. Most people crumble when isolated. You didn't. You got quieter, stronger, harder to read. That's when curiosity turns into surveillance. Think about it. When someone doesn't react the way they're supposed to, it unsettles everyone who depends on predictable behavior. You didn't overshare. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't perform for the room. You kept moving forward while they were still trying to understand the last version of you. That gap scared them. Here's the part nobody says out loud. Watching is an admission of inferiority. You don't study what you believe you've already mastered. You don't monitor what you think is beneath you. The moment they started paying attention, they confessed without words that you were ahead of them in some way they couldn't define. That's why it got obsessive. They weren't watching for mistakes, they were watching for cracks, and the longer they watched, the more unsettled they became. No breakdown, no public collapse, no dramatic failure, just steady movement, just controlled silence, just results stacking quietly in the background. That's when fear replaces curiosity. You may have wondered at some point, if they're watching, why haven't they acted? Because watchers hesitate, actors take risks, and they didn't know where you stood. They couldn't read your next move. You weren't broadcasting intent. You weren't leaking strategy. You were existing without explanation. That is a power move, whether you intended it or not. Picture it like this: a room full of people talking and one person says nothing. Eventually, all eyes drift toward the silence. Not because it's empty, but because it feels loaded. That was you, the quiet variable, the unsolved equation, the presence that didn't beg to be understood. They thought time would expose you. Instead, time fortified you, and now comes the shift. Watching turns into wanting access. Observation turns into invitation. The meeting request isn't about collaboration, it's about control. It's about finally sitting across from the person they couldn't figure out from a distance. They want to see if the calm is real, if the confidence is earned, if the strength holds up close. Here's the motivation they never planned on giving you. You already won the first phase without saying a word. You survived the observation period. You didn't self-destruct under scrutiny. You didn't hand them ammunition. You didn't become reactive. You became untouchable. If you're wondering whether this is coincidence, it's not. People don't watch nothing. Systems don't monitor irrelevance. Meetings don't get requested with people who failed. This is the universe responding to consistency. Pressure applied. Stability maintained. Outcome achieved. The enemy hates this part because there's no insult left that works, no label that sticks, no rumor that lands. You outgrew the narrative while they were still clinging to it. They watched you become something they can't easily interrupt. This is not about ego. This is about awareness. You weren't hunted, you were assessed, and you passed without even knowing it was a test. That's why the watching began. That's why it lasted months, and that's why it didn't end quietly. The watchers didn't find weakness. They found resolve, and now they want a meeting because distance stopped protecting them. Number 2, you turned their surveillance into a trap. They thought they were collecting data. They didn't realize they were volunteering it. This is where the story stops being about fear and starts being about control. Most people, the moment they sense pressure, either freeze or flee. They explain themselves, they overshare, they panic post. They try to clean up their image like guilt is already proven. You didn't do any of that. You stayed. You adjusted. You leaned in so calmly that it confused everyone watching from the shadows. They expected you to react. You didn't. They expected you to retreat. You didn't. They expected chaos. You gave them choreography. Here's the part that messes with their heads. You never confronted the watching. You never acknowledged it openly. You treated it like background noise, like something beneath explanation. That alone flipped the power dynamic. Because the moment you don't act like you're being hunted, the hunters start questioning who's really in control. Imagine this. Someone thinks they're tailing you through a maze, carefully tracking every turn. What they don't realize is you designed the maze. You know where every dead end leads. You know which turns mean nothing. You start walking slower, not out of fear, but to let them catch up just enough to reveal themselves. That's what you did with your life. You changed nothing major, just minutes, just details, just enough to make their notes unreliable. One day you leave earlier, another day you stay longer. You post something vague that sounds important but means nothing. You talk openly about plans that don't exist, knowing ears are listening. You let them chase ghosts while you stayed grounded in reality. This wasn't paranoia, this was strategy. People watching from a distance assume every move is intentional, so you gave them intention without substance. They filled in the gaps themselves. That's the dangerous part. When observers start writing your story for you, they expose their assumptions, and assumptions are weaknesses. You might have wondered, am I playing games? No. You were testing reactions. You were mapping interest. You were seeing who leaned forward when you shifted, who asked questions that didn't fit, who suddenly needed to know more than they earned the right to. You weren't hiding, you were filtering. The loudest truth is revealed by who panics when nothing actually happens. They thought your cryptic moments meant secrets. They thought your silence meant plotting. They thought your calm meant confidence hiding something bigger. They weren't entirely wrong, just wrong about what. The real secret wasn't your next move, it was that you were watching them watch you. Imagine this, two people at a chessboard. One thinks the game hasn't started yet. The other has been counting moves since the first piece was touched. That was the gap between you and them. They were reacting to surface-level signals. You were tracking behavior over time. Here's the part that should motivate you deeply. You didn't need power to do this. You didn't need authority. You didn't need status. You needed patience. And patience breaks people who rely on urgency to feel important. While they rushed to conclusions, you slowed everything down. They built files, you built context, they tracked moments, you tracked patterns, they chased noise, you followed behavior. At some point, the watchers started contradicting themselves. One expected you here, another logged you there, one assumed intention, another saw nothing. Confusion crept in, and confusion inside a watching system is poison. Because once they can't agree on what they're seeing, control starts slipping. Confusion is what happens when control meets intelligence. It can't rush. You didn't need to fake brilliance. You let them project it onto you. That's the brilliance they can't handle. When people start believing you're 10 steps ahead, even if you're just standing still, they begin sabotaging themselves. They overthink. They overcorrect. They reveal motive. You may have asked yourself, what if I'm wrong? That's normal, but notice this. If you were wrong, nothing would have escalated. Watching would have faded. Interest would have died. Instead, it intensified. The more neutral you stayed, the more focused they became. That alone answers the question. Imagine this like fishing, except you never cast a line. You just stood near the water, and fish kept surfacing on their own, curious, unsettled, drawn by stillness. That's not manipulation. That's presence doing the work. You also learned something critical about yourself in this phase. You realized you could sit with uncertainty without collapsing. You could exist under observation without shrinking. You could be misunderstood without correcting the record. That's a level of self-trust most people never reach. Anyone who needs to be understood immediately is not ready to be powerful. The enemy hates this because it exposes the truth. You didn't flip the script with aggression. You flipped it with restraint. You didn't win by being louder. You won by being clearer internally. And clarity doesn't announce itself. It just moves differently. Now step back and see the irony clearly. They wanted to collect evidence. They ended up creating it against themselves. Every extra glance, every unnecessary question, every sudden interest confirmed what you already sensed. Watching turned into exposure. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The roles had already reversed. You weren't the subject anymore. You were the variable they couldn't control, the unknown inside their system. This is why the meeting request came later, not during the watching, after. Because once someone realizes they've been observed back, distance stops feeling safe. They want proximity. They want eye contact. They want to see if the calm holds up in person. Here's the final truth of this section. You didn't outsmart them by being clever. You outlasted them by being steady. You didn't need to dominate. You needed to endure. And endurance always wins in the long run. They thought they were playing surveillance. You were playing time. And time always sides with the one who doesn't rush. Slow motion checkmate wasn't a move. It was a mindset. Number 3, the day fear stopped working on you. The moment fear failed, they panicked. About 3 months in, the watching changed flavor. It got sloppy, too obvious, too close, the kind of careless that isn't accidental. That's when you understood the shift. They weren't trying to catch you slipping anymore. They were trying to see if you would flinch. This was no longer surveillance. This was a test. They wanted you to feel it, the eyes, the presence, the pressure. They expected you to tighten up, censor yourself, dull your edges. That's what usually happens. Most people shrink when they know they're being watched. They sand themselves down into something safe and boring. You didn't. You expanded. Here's the part that scares them. You became more honest, more relaxed, more you. You didn't perform innocence. You didn't fake confidence. You didn't hide your intensity. You walked, talked, and moved like someone who had already made peace with being seen. That flipped the room upside down. Imagine this. Someone shines a spotlight expecting a rat to scatter, and instead the figure stands still, looks back, and doesn't blink. The light stops being a weapon at that point. It becomes a mirror. That's what happened. Their gaze lost power because you stopped treating it like a threat. Fear is only useful when someone still needs your permission to exist. They started asking themselves uncomfortable questions. Why aren't they nervous? Why aren't they hiding? Why do they seem clearer now? The harder they stared, the steadier you became. And that steadiness is dangerous. Because it suggests something worse than rebellion. It suggests self-ownership. You might have wondered if this was reckless. It wasn't. It was grounded. You weren't trying to provoke them. You were refusing to be managed by invisible pressure. You didn't posture. You didn't overcorrect. You stayed aligned. That's when observers lose control. Think of it like fire. Blow on it too hard and it spreads. Ignore it and it burns clean. Their attention didn't weaken you, it refined you. It burned away hesitation. It forced you to choose who you were without approval. Nothing terrifies control more than someone who doesn't ask to be spared. That's when they realized something had gone wrong. Watching you wasn't shrinking you, it was sharpening you, and now the danger wasn't what you might do, it was who you already were. Number 4, when you let them watch on purpose. They thought they were studying behavior. They didn't realize they were attending a show. This is where it crossed the line from observation to embarrassment. They came in expecting fear, tight shoulders, short answers, a nervous system on edge. Instead, they found fascination, comfort, a presence that didn't dodge the spotlight but stood calmly inside it. You didn't vanish when the eyes got heavier. You leaned forward. That alone broke their expectations. They assumed distance would protect them, so you closed the distance first, not aggressively, casually, like someone who knows the room already belongs to them. You didn't lock doors, you opened windows. You didn't guard your movements, you made them visible. And visibility, when chosen, is dominance. Imagine this. Someone believes they're spying through a one-way mirror, only to realize the glass has been transparent the entire time. No panic, no scramble, just you, standing there, aware, composed, and unbothered. At that moment, the mirror stops being protection. It becomes exposure. The spotlight only burns people who haven't decided who they are. They expected defensive behavior. Instead, you moved with intention. You spoke clearly. You laughed easily. You didn't explain yourself, but you didn't hide either. That smile you wore wasn't friendliness. It was consent. A quiet signal that said, "I see you, and I'm not impressed." That's when fear switched sides. Their notes started changing. Language softened. Certainty cracked. Subject appears aware. Subject seems comfortable. Subject is not reacting as predicted. What they couldn't write was the truth. You weren't cooperating, you were directing. Think of it like a stage. They thought they were backstage crew, pulling strings in the dark. You stepped under the lights and let them realize too late they were sitting in the audience. Every movement you made had rhythm. Every pause had weight. They weren't controlling the scene anymore. They were trying to keep up with it. When observation stops shaping behavior, it starts revealing weakness. You didn't perform to impress. You performed to clarify, to show that being watched no longer altered you. That's the moment surveillance turns useless. Because once someone chooses visibility, control evaporates. They came to watch you unravel. They stayed to watch you command. Number 5. The meeting is not an invitation, it's a confession. They don't want answers. They want reassurance that you're human like them. Let's strip the fantasy away. They didn't call this meeting because they were impressed. They called it because they were disturbed. For months, they watched, measured, compared, waited for the moment you would slip into the same pattern as everyone else. Fear, approval-seeking, collapse. It never came. That's the problem. Every person they studied before you followed a script. Pressure increased, posture shrank, eyes lowered, words softened, identity bent. You didn't do any of that. You stayed consistent, calm, grounded. You didn't speed up when watched. You didn't slow down either. You stayed yourself under a microscope, and that broke their framework. Here's the truth they won't say in the meeting. They don't understand you. Not because you're mysterious, but because you don't run on the fuel they know how to control. Fear doesn't steer you. Validation doesn't bribe you. Attention doesn't inflate you. And someone like that can't be managed from a distance. Imagine this: a system designed to pressure test people suddenly encounters a material that doesn't crack, bend, or warp. The system doesn't celebrate. It panics because its tools stop working. That's you. You exposed a limitation they didn't know they had. Control only works on people who still need permission. The meeting isn't about cooperation. It's about proximity. They want to look you in the eyes and see if the steadiness is real. They want to feel your presence without filters. They want to confirm whether the power they sensed from afar holds up close. That's not dominance. That's doubt. You turned surveillance into performance, observation into exposure, pressure into proof. And now they're left with one option: sit across from the thing they couldn't reduce and hope proximity gives them back a sense of control. It won't. Because the power you carry isn't positional. It isn't borrowed. It doesn't disappear in rooms or rise with applause. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and not needing the meeting to confirm it. They're not summoning you. They're admitting you can't be ignored. Number 6. The one thing about you they couldn't weaponize. They searched for leverage and found nothing to grab. This is the part that still keeps them uneasy. Not angry, not loud, uneasy, because fear loves handles. It needs something to pull, something to twist, something to threaten. They looked for cracks. They found clarity. They searched for wounds. They found scars that had already healed. That's not inspiring to people who rely on pressure. That's terrifying. You didn't flinch because you already knew yourself. You didn't rush to defend weaknesses because you had already faced them alone. There was nothing to expose that you hadn't already integrated. No secret shame to drag into the light. No hidden story they could use to make you smaller. When someone has already walked through their own fire, outside heat doesn't work. Imagine trying to blackmail someone with a truth they've already accepted. It lands flat. Imagine trying to scare someone with a past they already survived. It sounds hollow. That was their dilemma. Every usual tool failed. Every angle led nowhere. You can't threaten someone who already made peace with their shadow. What really rattled them was your consistency. You weren't strong one day and scattered the next. You weren't confident only when things went well. Your calm didn't depend on circumstances. It showed up in pressure, in silence, in uncertainty. That kind of steadiness doesn't come from pretending. It comes from internal alignment. Picture this: a storm rages, trees bend, signs shake, everything reacts. And in the middle of it, a structure stands unmoved, not flashy, not aggressive, just grounded. The storm doesn't know what to do with it. That was you under observation. And yes, there were moments when you knew the cameras were there. You didn't cover them. You didn't challenge them. You smiled, not mockingly, knowing, like someone sharing a private joke with the universe. That smile said everything. I see you. I'm fine, and you can't touch this. The most dangerous people don't hide. They stand comfortably exposed. That's what terrified them, not your strength, your unreachability. Number 7. You turned their machine into a mirror. Systems don't fail loudly. They fail when they start explaining themselves. This is where everything quietly fell apart for them. Not with alarms, not with conflict, with confusion. Their system was built to observe targets, not reflect observers. But the longer they watched you, the more the focus shifted. Reports stopped being about what you did and started revealing how they felt about it. That's when the machine began eating itself. They weren't tracking a threat anymore. They were circling a contradiction. You didn't behave like someone under pressure. You didn't escalate. You didn't resist. You lived normally, and that normalcy broke their models. Because their system depends on extremes, panic or compliance, collapse or rebellion, you offered neither. Imagine a lie detector hooked up to someone who isn't lying. The machine starts malfunctioning, not because it's broken, but because it has nothing to detect. That was their problem. You didn't trigger alerts. You didn't fit categories. You didn't confirm assumptions. Every data point pointed back at the observer. When control can't label you, it starts questioning itself. Their notes became opinionated, emotional, defensive. One saw confidence as arrogance, another read calm as defiance, another suspected strategy where there was simply self-trust. They weren't documenting you anymore. They were projecting themselves onto you. Fear leaks when structure weakens. You didn't need to challenge the system. You let it run against something it wasn't designed to handle. A person who doesn't react theatrically. A person who doesn't need permission to exist. A person whose baseline is stable. That kind of presence exposes how fragile artificial control really is. Think of it like a scale calibrated for chaos, suddenly weighing balance. The readings make no sense. The operators argue, the system stutters, not because you attacked it, but because you refused to validate it. Normalcy is dangerous when a system survives on dysfunction. They thought they were watching a subject. They ended up studying themselves. And once a system sees its own fear, it can't unsee it. Number 8. You exposed the limit they never planned to hit. They needed you to be exceptional, because if you weren't, their fear had no excuse. This is where their confidence collapsed quietly. They thought they were profiling you, measuring traits, labeling behaviors, placing you neatly inside a category that made sense to them. It never worked. Not because you were unpredictable, but because you were too grounded, too normal in the ways that matter. And that terrified them more than chaos ever could. They needed you to be special in a dramatic way, gifted, extreme, an outlier they could explain away. Because if you were just a regular human who refused to be afraid, refused to bend, refused to shrink, then their entire framework was flawed. That question haunted them. If you can do this without permission, without panic, without collapsing, why didn't they? Imagine this. A rule book written to control behavior suddenly meets someone who isn't breaking rules, but also isn't obeying them emotionally. The book doesn't catch fire, it just becomes useless. Page after page means nothing. That was you inside their system. They don't fear rebellion as much as they fear proof. Every report they filed became a confession, not about you, but about their limits. You didn't confess to being special. You didn't claim power. You didn't dramatize your presence. You simply existed without fear. And that existence forced an unbearable comparison. If strength can look this calm, then what have they been doing all this time? Think of a locked door everyone assumes is sealed until one person casually turns the handle and walks through. No force, no noise, just the realization that the lock was never as strong as advertised. That's the lesson you became. They weren't learning how to deal with you. They were learning how exposed they were. The most dangerous lesson is realizing you never needed permission. You didn't teach them with speeches. You taught them by standing still, and that lesson cost them their certainty. Number 9. Your freedom is the glitch they can't patch. They don't fear what you are, they fear what you make possible. Let's clear this up before they twist it. You're not special in the way they hoped you'd be. You're not rare because of talent, privilege, or some hidden advantage. You're rare because you're free. And freedom is the one thing their system was never built to tolerate. They can regulate behavior. They can label personalities. They can predict fear, ambition, insecurity, hunger for approval. Those are easy. Those run on patterns. Freedom doesn't. Freedom doesn't ask how it will be received. It doesn't adjust itself to fit expectations. It doesn't wait for validation. And once someone sees it up close, it spreads. That's the real threat. Imagine a bird sitting calmly on an open window while everyone else argues about the cage. Not screaming, not rebelling, just gone whenever it wants. The cage doesn't look powerful anymore once someone proves the door was never locked. That's what your existence did to them. Control survives on the belief that escape is impossible. They didn't feel attacked by you, they felt exposed, because your calm showed how much effort they put into maintaining a prison they never questioned. You didn't break rules, you didn't challenge authority, you simply stopped living as if invisible permission slips mattered, and that made their structure look outdated overnight. They want the meeting because freedom confuses them. They hope you'll explain it, package it, reduce it into steps they can monitor and neutralize. They want to believe you did something clever instead of something honest. Because if freedom is just a choice they never made, that truth is unbearable. Think of it like this. A crowd standing in line for years suddenly notices one person not standing at all, not protesting, not complaining, just living outside the line. The line immediately feels optional. Dangerous thought. Freedom isn't loud. It's obvious once seen. That's why they're uneasy. You didn't escape dramatically. You walked out quietly. And now the cage looks ridiculous. They don't want your power. They want the explanation that makes them feel safe again. They won't get it. Number 10. The room where they expected control and met calm. You don't prepare for a meeting when the outcome already knows your name. They think preparation is happening on both sides. Spreadsheets, talking points, power seats. They believe readiness equals leverage. That belief alone tells you everything. You don't prepare because preparation assumes uncertainty. And you're not uncertain. This meeting isn't a test for you. It's a reveal for them. They studied you for months expecting nerves, justifications, explanations. People usually walk into rooms like this trying to manage impressions, soften edges, negotiate their worth. You won't. You won't need to. You already lived under their microscope and nothing cracked. A table and some eye contact won't change that. Imagine rehearsing a storm only to meet clear weather. That's what your calm does to their expectations. It disarms without effort. They planned for resistance or submission. They didn't plan for curiosity. They didn't plan for someone who listens without needing approval, who speaks without needing to convince. The most unsettling presence in a room is someone who doesn't need it to go well. They expect defensiveness. You bring steadiness. They expect explanations. You bring silence that makes them feel it. You don't rush to answer because you don't feel accused. You ask questions not to challenge but to clarify who's actually in control. And that reversal lands hard. Think of it like actors stepping on stage only to realize the script was already written somewhere else. They thought this was an interrogation. It's a mirror. Every question they ask exposes what they still don't understand. Every pause you allow forces them to sit with it. Power shifts the moment one side stops performing. This meeting is just another scene, not because you're manipulating it, but because you stopped believing rooms define you. They can't threaten what doesn't depend on them. They can't intimidate what already stood alone. They came prepared to manage you. They'll leave realizing they never could. Number 11. The version of you they studied no longer exists. They showed up with notes. You showed up as the update they never installed. They think they're ready because they did their homework. They're not. Every question they prepared is aimed at a ghost, an older version of you that no longer lives here. While they were documenting behaviors, you were shedding skins. While they were freezing snapshots, you were moving, slow enough to look stable, fast enough to stay unreachable. That's the gap they can't cross. They're about to ask questions that made sense months ago, motivations you've already outgrown, fears you no longer negotiate with. They're reaching for explanations that belonged to a past chapter, unaware the book has been rewritten twice since then. And nothing is more humiliating than interrogating someone who has already moved on. Imagine trying to grab smoke with bare hands. The tighter the grip, the faster it disappears. That's what happens when they try to pin you down with old definitions. You're not evasive. You're just no longer solid in the shape they memorized, and that makes their confidence melt. You can't catch up to someone who stopped waiting. They'll feel it mid-conversation, the disconnect, the subtle lag. Their questions won't land, their assumptions won't fit. They'll sense that the person in front of them doesn't need to prove growth because it's already embodied. You won't correct them, you won't rush them, you'll let the mismatch speak. Their system was built to handle resistance, compliance, ambition, fear. It was not built to handle evolution that doesn't announce itself. Someone who doesn't rebel loudly or submit quietly, but simply outgrows the frame. That kind of movement breaks tracking. Think of a map drawn for a city that no longer exists, streets renamed, buildings gone, landmarks moved. The traveler isn't lost, the map is obsolete. They didn't fall behind because you were faster. They fell behind because you didn't pause. They can't catch up because catching up would require admitting they missed something fundamental, and that admission costs them the illusion of control. You're not ahead of them in the race. You left the track entirely. Number 12. You didn't lead a revolt, you broke the spell. Revolutions don't start with noise. They start when someone stops believing the lie. This is the part they will never forgive themselves for. They didn't mean to create anything. They didn't plan a movement. They weren't trying to empower you. They were trying to contain you. But every second they watched, every note they took, every moment they focused on you, they did the opposite of what control is supposed to do. They gave you an audience, and an audience changes everything. You never asked for followers. You never announced a mission. You never told anyone to wake up. You just existed freely, visibly, consistently. That was enough. Because when someone lives without fear, inside a system built on fear, it exposes the trick. People start noticing, not because you preached, but because you proved something without words. Imagine a room where everyone whispers because they think sound is forbidden. Then one person speaks at normal volume. No punishment follows. The room doesn't collapse. The walls don't fall. The silence dies instantly. That's what you did to them. Power hates witnesses more than rebels. By studying you, they accidentally gave your behavior weight. They treated you like you mattered, and others felt it. Attention is currency. They spent it on you without realizing they were funding the very thing that undermines them. Suddenly, your calm looked intentional. Your confidence looked earned. Your freedom looked repeatable. Here's what really shattered their illusion. You didn't claim power. You didn't brand yourself as special. You didn't even try to lead. That made your existence undeniable proof that control only works on those who agree to it. That's a dangerous idea once it spreads. Think of a crack in glass. One hairline fracture doesn't shatter the window, but everyone sees it. And once seen, the glass never feels solid again. That's you. Not loud, not violent, just visible enough to make belief impossible to maintain. Control survives on faith. You killed the faith. You didn't overthrow anything. You revealed it, and revelations don't need permission to spread. Number 13. They came to observe and left unstable. The most dangerous influence is someone who never tries to influence. This is where the story gets uncomfortable for them. The watchers didn't just track you, they changed because of you. Not overnight, not dramatically, slowly. In stages they didn't notice until it was too late. First came confusion. You weren't reacting correctly. Then frustration. You weren't bending. Then curiosity. Why is this person still steady? And finally, the part that terrified their system the most, admiration. They never planned for that. They weren't supposed to feel anything. Watching is meant to be detached, clinical, safe, but you disrupted that distance by staying calm, by staying human, by refusing to perform fear. They started comparing themselves to you, and comparison is where control dies. Imagine a guard pacing a wall for years, believing the wall protects them. Then one day, they notice someone walking freely on the other side, unbothered, unharmed, alive. The guard doesn't revolt. They don't quit. They start wondering why they're still pacing. That question alone is corrosive. No system survives its enforcers asking honest questions. You didn't recruit them. You didn't preach. You didn't even acknowledge their internal shift. That's what made it irreversible. They learned without permission. They absorbed without being told to. Watching you live without fear rewired them in ways training never could. You didn't give them a lesson. You became one. Some of them tried to resist it, doubled down, labeled you arrogant, dangerous, an anomaly, but labels didn't stick when the evidence was daily and undeniable. You weren't reckless. You weren't reckless. You were free. And freedom is persuasive in silence. Think of rust spreading on metal. It doesn't announce itself. It just weakens the structure until strength is an illusion. That's what happened inside their ranks. Their programming cracked quietly. You don't convert watchers. You outgrow the rules they enforce. They didn't stop being watchers. They stopped being sure. And once certainty breaks, control never fully recovers. Number 14. The interrogation that turns into a confession. They'll call it questions. It's really surrender in slow motion. They think this meeting is about pressure, about control, about finally sitting you down and seeing if you crack when the room closes in. That illusion won't survive the first 5 minutes, because interrogations only work when someone feels cornered. You won't. You'll sit there, calm, grounded, unbothered, and that calm will do more damage than any answer ever could. Watch how it unfolds. Their questions won't be sharp. They'll be careful, framed like curiosity, softened like concern. Not because they're kind, but because they're searching for something they lost, certainty. They won't ask how you did what you did. They'll ask why it didn't break you. That difference matters. Imagine someone staring at a locked door their whole life, believing it's sealed shut. Then they meet someone who never tried to force it, never fought it, never even acknowledged it, and somehow ended up outside. The first reaction isn't anger, it's disbelief. The second is envy. That's the room you're walking into. People interrogate when they want power. They ask for help when power stops working. They'll project authority, but listen closely. Their words will expose longing. They want to know how you live without the constant fear they normalize, how you move without asking permission they still think is required, how you stay steady without approval they still chase. You won't need to convince them. Your presence already answered the question. Think of it like a mirror placed where they expected a wall. They came ready to push. Instead, they'll see themselves, their limits, their compromises, their invisible cage, and cages feel unbearable once noticed. You won't dominate the room. You won't submit to it. You'll let it reshape itself around you. That's the part they didn't prepare for. Freedom doesn't argue, it reflects. They won't leave with answers. They'll leave with doubt. And doubt is where every real change begins. And now we close this exactly where it was always heading. Not with noise, not with celebration, with clarity. You were never being chased. You were being studied because you refused to live scared. You didn't break the system. You outgrew it. And once that happened, the watching had no choice but to turn into a meeting, not to control